Hi, everybody. Well, what a fantastic film. Congratulations. That was really great. I'm Eric Sanderson. I'm the Vice President for Urban Conservation and the Director of the Center for Conservation and Restoration Ecology. Yeah, that's right. Here at NYBG. And I should say a recovering salt marsh ecologist. And I'm joined with a really stellar panel here of the filmmaker and two scientists who've worked on mangroves all around the world. And so I'd like to ask you to introduce yourselves first.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. My name is Sarah MacDonald. I'm the executive producer of Blue Carbon, the film.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brad Oberle, and I'm an associate curator here at the New York Botanical Garden, and I do my work in the Center for Conservation and Restoration Ecology.
Good afternoon. I'm Ashley McGovern. I'm the Senior Vice President of Oceans at Conservation International. We served as the technical partners on this film and are very, very proud to be the lead partner on the Espada project.
Terrific. So we're going to chat amongst ourselves for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a chance to take questions from the audience. So if you have thoughts or ideas or things you really want to know about the making of the film or what it means for conservation, then I invite you to think about that. The theme of today's climate symposium at the Botanical Garden as part of New York City Climate Week is how we harness biodiversity for climate resilience. And I think one of the clearest and best examples of that is actually this blue carbon sort of idea. So I think, in the film, it's pretty effective about that. And I don't know how many people are New Yorkers that are here, but we live in a low coastal city that once upon a time hosted lots and lots of blue carbon. There were extensive salt marshes here in the Bronx, just a couple miles south of here on the Bronx River, all along the south shore of the Bronx. Flushing Bay, if you've been to Flushing Meadows Park, that used to be Flushing Meadows, which were a vast salt marsh compound in Queens. And then on the south side, Jamaica Bay and Brooklyn and Queens had enormous fringing salt marshes. If you've ever been driving on the Belt Parkway or if you've ever flown into JFK Airport, those are all places that were formerly reservoirs of blue carbon. And same out to Staten Island and down the coast of New Jersey and so forth and so on. So although many of the places that the film talked about are tropical places farther away, it's also true that it applies here. This is a solution that applies everywhere. So I thought maybe we could start with Sarah to learn a little bit about the making of the movie. And you work for a for-profit, right? Film studio, is that right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Like, why did this topic, as opposed to a superhero movie, appeal to your company?
If I could make a superhero movie, I would.
Or maybe you did.
Well, that's true. I'm not going to make as much money, sadly. Yes, I am the founder of a film production company in London. And I'm actually a journalist and specialized in undercover investigations, normally with human rights subjects. So undercover in Burma, undercover in North Korea, China, the Catholic Church and child abuse, those lovely topics. And so it came as a bit of a surprise to me that I started making big, epic environmental films. But that is because I realized that actually there is no greater human rights crisis going on in the world today than the climate crisis. So I am very inspired. Again, I'm driven by the human aspect of this existential crisis that we are facing. And this is the second of our very big epic films. Our first one was called The Great Green Wall, which was about growing a wall of trees across sub-Sahara Africa. Blue carbon, I have to admit, I didn't even know what it was. And I dreamed up the idea of just, if we've got trees on the land, maybe there are some trees under the water. And then discovered that the phrase had already been coined by some amazing scientists at Conservation International about 10 years ago, Blue Carbon, which of course is a great title for a film. And we were really, really lucky. I mean, this is a $3 million film, and it took us 3 years to make it. We were extremely fortunate to discover Jayda, who is obviously an environmental toxicologist and a DJ, trying to bring these environmental films, which can be quite scientific, quite dry. You have to use every tool in your box to be able to draw the audiences. We have to tell a hopeful story. We do not want to leave audiences depressed. We need audiences to feel engaged. We don't want to talk inside an echo chamber. So we really, really want to make films that are going to reach different audiences. We were really lucky that CNN came on board very early on, and some European broadcasters as well. We were very lucky with HHMI Tanglebank Studios. They were our significant partners, and it allowed us to create a big film. So what's amazing is that we are showing this film at like Glastonbury. It was at Glastonbury this year, showing it at music festivals, and really trying to reach a very different audience, which I think we really are doing. But now, of course, after the film has been made, that's just the beginning. We then back it up with what we call an impact campaign, and that is to really try and make a difference. So, you know, a few people will see the film, but hopefully we will actually reach many, many more through the impact campaign, which is both grassroots but also high policy level. And our biggest aim is to get blue carbon onto official national agendas of many, many countries around the world to protect and to restore.
That's terrific. Yeah, congratulations. What a wonderful film. And your comments remind me a little bit of a theme that came up in this morning's symposium. We were talking about protecting, restoring, and transforming as elements of how we address both climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And you know, the transforming part is really about people. How do we transform our thinking and our minds and our value system, really? And I think film is a really powerful way of doing that. Ashley, let me turn to you and ask you a little bit more from your perspective about blue carbon. How much is there out there? How much more potential is there? What can we do to make this an important part of solving the climate crisis?
Thank you, Eric. You know, it's funny that you say you didn't know what blue carbon was. About 15 years ago, nobody knew what blue carbon was at all. It was actually something that was incredibly buried in the scientific literature. It did exist. We knew that these blue carbon systems, they sequester 10 times more carbon than their terrestrial counterparts. So acre for acre, they're the most important carbon sponge on the planet. And the reason why is because the terrestrial forests, they put the carbon into their trunks, into their leaves. These systems put it deep into the earth. That's why if you're ever in one of these systems, you'll see, or if you saw the coring that was done in the film, it's very mucky. It's kind of icky, and frankly, it smells a little bit. That's the carbon. That's what that is. That's a good thing. We want it down there, and they're able to put it deep, deep, deep into the roots and really keep it there forever, practically. We actually call this irreplaceable carbon. So there are other carbon systems where you pull the nature out, the carbon goes up into the atmosphere, and you can recapture it in a reasonable amount of time. There are some forests, and certainly these blue carbon ecosystems, that once they're destroyed, they put all of that massive amount of carbon into the atmosphere, and it cannot be replaced, at least within our lifetimes, not within a reasonable amount of time. So this protection piece, especially for blue carbon ecosystems, is absolutely essential, because they're just not going to sequester it to be able to make up that net impact you have when you plume it way up into the atmosphere. But 15 years ago, nobody knew anything about this. It was buried in the scientific literature, and some of my colleagues found it and went, oh, this is really interesting. We're trying to find solutions to mitigate climate change. Might there be something here? Could this be an argument for the protection and restoration of these systems? And we went to the policymakers, because we always want good science to change policy, and they said, I can't do anything with this, right? Our policymakers need the science to actually answer very specific questions that they can then take action on. So we pulled together a group called the Blue Carbon Initiative. We took all the best blue carbon scientists around the world. We put them in a room, this is actually true, in the basement of a office in Brussels, I think it was, no windows or anything. And we put a couple of policymakers in the room with them, and we said, all right, you've got to tell us what questions do we need to answer so that you can put this on a policy agenda. And then took this community of scientists and said, okay, now go answer the questions in that way. That was about 15 years ago. We did some great work. We took it to the UNFCCC, the climate COP, about 10 years ago, and we had a panel in a room like this. There were 4 people on stage, nobody in the audience. Not a single person showed up. It was not a good thing. But it shows you where, not just blue carbon systems, where frankly the ocean is on the climate agenda at the time. This is only a decade ago. Fast forward to the Paris Agreement in 2016. We got a win. And the win was in the document, we got it to say, and oceans. That's it. You can do a little Control F for all the documents previous to that for the word ocean, mangrove, not in there, absent, devoid. But we got that and oceans in there. And then we were able to bring together a couple more collaboratives like the Global Mangrove Alliance, which was mentioned this morning, the International Partnership for Blue Carbon, and several others to bring the community together to say, okay, now that we have it in there, we have the knowledge, how do we make this so that these systems can be a contribution that countries can put forward to the Paris Climate Agreement? And today we have that. They're able to put it as one of their NDCs, or the natural determined contribution, which is a huge, huge effort. And to then get that, we've got these projects now all around the world, like the one you saw in Cispata, Colombia, where we're creating financial mechanisms to then ensure the protection is durable. And what's really important to us is that the people who are on the front lines of those protections are benefiting, and benefiting directly. I mean, it kind of really stuck out to me. We heard the story about the women with the oysters, and they were saying, oh, these women are replanting hectares voluntarily, right? Another way we're taking advantage of female labor in the world, right? We need to be rewarding them, because that is a gift not only for themselves and their communities, but frankly for all of us. So we're trying to develop these programs and projects, and well, in this film especially, and in my heart, Cispata is in so many ways a success story. We really built that model so that the return on those blue carbon investments is reinvested directly into the community. But I was just there, and I was with Ignacia, and she will tell you they're living in the same houses. They're still struggling their kids to send their kids to school. They really are, they're benefiting, but are they really that better off? Their lives have not been transformed. They're grateful, but we feel it's not enough. So now we're trying to take this a little further, and we're asking ourselves, what are those business models that can be scaled globally that rely upon a healthy blue carbon system? You know, I think about it, we've done this in coffee. So coffee, if you grow it in a forest that's under the shade, you actually can get a higher yield, you can do it for a lower cost, and you have intact nature and the farmers benefit. It's kind of a win-win. So what's the shade-grown coffee for these coastal ecosystems, which is the next frontier to ensure that not only are they getting returns on these credits, but they can actually start businesses and improve their livelihoods. Because this is something that isn't just, you know, far off in these exotic places, but as you mentioned, these ecosystems are close to home too, and these aren't just things we need them to do, but we all need to do it together.
Right, right. That's beautiful. Thank you. That was very, very good. So Brad, let me turn to you. I know you've actually done some mangrove restoration work. I wonder if you could, you've been in the mud yourself, right? So, yeah, can you speak to some of the challenges, but also the opportunities you see in mangrove restoration?
Absolutely, and thanks, Eric, for putting it that way, because I think everybody on the panel agrees that this is a challenging problem, but there are so many opportunities. And if we can't share those opportunities in a way that engages people, like the film did so brilliantly, we've really lost the battle before it started. So I'll talk a little bit about my experience restoring a very complicated mangrove that actually was pretty small, and speaks specifically, I think, to 3 different kinds of challenges. that I think are true in that mangrove, they're true in other mangroves, and they're true in blue carbon systems in general. So the first one is just practical. You saw Jayda take a spill, right? Working in blue carbon is a lot more complicated. So any restoration anywhere is going to require you to get people, plants, and equipment to a place. Now do that on a boat in the muck. It's just more challenging. So that ratchets up the logistics and that ratchets up the expense. But that probably is the easiest problem to solve. Policy, while it's important, can also make blue carbon restoration really complicated. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When you're working on restoration in a terrestrial system, it's pretty easy to figure out who controls it. Those lines blur as you start to move off the coast, and that's where blue carbon is found. So the restoration project that I led, we had to spend about 10% of our budget just to apply for permits from 3 different agencies, one of which was actually giving us the money to do the restoration itself. So that can vary depending on what kind of jurisdiction you're in, but it does add to the complexity. Probably the toughest part is that these systems are so precious. And I think that's a double-edged sword. So one side is that that's where most people want to be. That's where most people generate their livelihoods. And if you look at the threats to most blue carbon systems, they're coming from urbanization and agriculture. In fact, the Global Mangrove Alliance estimated that 60% of the mangroves we've lost since 1996 have been due to those 2 drivers. So what does that have to do with restoration? Well, that's people's lives. And as great as it would be to put a mangrove or a salt marsh back on top of New York City, we can't really do it. And similarly, people who have subsistence, agriculture, or extractive-based lifestyles in those coastal systems don't have lots of other great choices. So implementing restoration in that context means addressing a much bigger issue than just where you put the plants and who grants you a permit. So that's one aspect of precious, right? Those transformations are important and they involve people and the social element of what's going on. But mangroves are also precious in a different kind of sense, and all blue carbon systems are. And what I mean by that is that they're sensitive, that kind of precious, right? So in many ways, they're the model of resilience. They soak up lots of carbon, they protect us from storms. I'm actually going to take a moment to think about friends in Florida right now who depend on the mangroves, the seagrasses, and the salt marshes to protect them from a really scary storm right now. So those systems are very resilient. But as we saw from the example in the community talking about it in Cispada Bay in Colombia, subtle changes can really flip the switch on a blue carbon system. So a slight change in the hydrology that affects how water's moving around, a change in the sediment load, a change in the nutrients, can take what was once a robust and healthy system and flip it to something that's almost unrecognizable. And the community there used a metaphor that's really powerful about a heart attack. So there's a community of scientists in Florida who talk regularly about mangrove heart attack as a symptom of a change in the circulation in those systems. And what it means is that in these situations where you could restore a mangrove, just planting a plant is not necessarily going to solve your problem, because it's like giving somebody who has a heart attack an Advil, right? You have to address the critical issue, and then you have to address the systemic issue. And those are really complicated technical problems. So 3 Ps, practical, policy, precious, all problems. 2 optimistic things. So people and partnerships. The film did a brilliant job of illustrating how people have a stake and how people can power solutions. And that's something that I saw in Florida, a really different situation where we got dozens of people in kayaks to paddle across Sarasota Bay to plant natives on a hot day with the mosquitoes out. There's that kind of enthusiasm in cultures all around the planet. And engaging with that is absolutely critical, not just in getting the work done, but making sure that it's sustainable. So people are important. That grassroots perspective is important, as Sarah said before. But then also policy is vital. We have to be able to coordinate at the level of institutions and organizations to coordinate the resources that are really needed and the support for the communities that Ashley was talking about to make sure that those communities have a viable and sustainable economic future in these systems that everybody in the world relies on. And so that's something that I think is especially remarkable about being able to do that work here at NYBG. NYBG has been working in these mangrove systems for decades across the planet with communities to achieve impactful outcomes. And just recently, we joined the Global Mangrove Alliance, which is a really great organization with a really great set of goals that I think we here at NYBG will be able to help advance. Halt mangrove loss, restore half of what has gone, and protect twice as much as out there right now. And we have the experience and the resources to be able to help this partnership in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, that's great, Brad. Thank you. Yeah, I know some of the people in the room are longtime watchers of NYBG, and I think a subtext of today is you're seeing the programs at NYBG moving in this kind of more applied way in many, many different dimensions. And so I think that's something that'll be true, not just for this Climate Week, but for Climate Weeks coming forward. And Brad, I also wanted to thank you for mentioning the adaptation aspect of this, right? I use salt marshes as a great example of both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And I know here in New York City, what's really driving wetland restoration and stream daylighting and so forth is the climate concerns. Because it turns out the places where it's flooding during these heavy rain events that we've been getting are places that used to be former wetlands, right? And so by using that information and seeing where there are, we can start to plan the mitigation efforts. And in some cases, that's, there was a long discussion this spring called Rainproof NYC, and one of the things we talked about was what would a buyout program look like someday for New York City. And that's a huge move for New York City, and I think is a measure of the concerns about what it might mean if for the whole city if we don't adapt these low-lying places and actually restore some of these ecosystems that we've lost. Okay, we have time for one more question. I just want to hit this one briefly because it is Climate Week. We are here in New York City, and I think the carbon financing aspect of blue carbon is really important. So Ashley, could you just take us in 30 seconds or a minute through what are the highlights of the blue carbon finance market that we should know about?
Okay, 30 seconds. Here's what I would say. I think it's an incredibly important market. I think it is one that is very, very complex, and I can't get into the details in 30 seconds, but one of the things that you'll see in headlines is a lot of criticism. A lot of criticism that is just being used as greenwashing or blue washing, and these corporations are not serious. And while, of course, there are going to be examples of that, the data actually don't bear it out. If you look at the companies who are investing in especially blue carbon credits, but even terrestrial credits, and you look at what they're doing, they're using these credits as the last mile. They're first looking at their own supply chains, they're looking at their own footprint, and they know that there's a gap in what they're able to accomplish in their own carbon projects. And when you look at these companies compared to all of the other companies out there that are not investing in carbon credits, they're above and beyond doing more even without the credits. So I think we do need to make sure they're verified, we do need to make sure they're robust systems, but we need this crediting market to continue. We need to support it, and we need to, of course, be appropriately critical, but we need it to continue, and it's a good news investment from the private sector who has trillions upon trillions of dollars that we don't have to help support. Doing it right so it goes to the communities, doing it right so that the system's actually there and the carbon is being sequestered is essential. I'll also say though, crediting's not a silver bullet and it's not enough. This is why we're going beyond in CISPADA. It's an important piece of the financing puzzle. It is something that is going to grow, but it is not going to solve the challenge.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. That's really good. Yeah, that's right. The reason capitalism has been destroying environments is because it doesn't see nature at all, right? It doesn't take into account. And, carbon credits is one of the mechanisms for this. And of course, there's going to be bumps along the road, but that doesn't mean it's not a good idea. So I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience, if I could see the audience. I see there's a hand there in the far back. Do you want to just speak out your question? Don't know if we have a microphone.
I have a comment. Thank you very much.
Okay, comment.
Really important.
Oh, there it is. There's a mic there.
Thank you very much for this really important documentary. I think it's really important for you to put it in the schools, get it out in the schools, get younger people thinking about it, going home, questioning their parents, having a conversation, and moving it along, because you need to reach a lot more people who are going to grow up and deal with this. We heard about it in An Inconvenient Truth in 1993, what Manhattan would look like. What have we done? I'm sure you've done a lot, but each generation needs to have that information, and I think this would be brilliant. Science and music. You'll get them.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I think I totally agree. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to say a few words about the distribution of the film?
Yeah, the film is actually being distributed country by country. So if we had sold it to a streamer like Netflix, then that would be it. But we actually have a distributor, and we're selling territory by territory. We also are working with big education organizations. HHMI is one of the biggest distributors of science educational material in the world. So they are also getting it out there. But please do spread the word.
Okay, yeah, thank you, that's great. I think we have time for one more question. Maybe there in the back. I don't know if the mic can migrate over that direction. In the far back. Oh yeah, okay. Well, just pick a question. There we go. The lights up here are brutal, so it's a little hard to see what's going on back there. Yes, please, thank you.
I was curious about, so you mentioned 15 years ago, this wasn't, top of policy agendas or anything like that. And I think that with, as you mentioned, there's a lot of skepticism around the carbon credit system and maybe potential for businesses to use it as a write-off and check it off and okay, that's it. So I'm curious your take on making sure blue carbon is, sustained as a part of policy agendas and for politicians and institutions and businesses, whatever, rather than maybe a hot button issue that's at the top of the agenda for a bit because everyone's talking about it and then everyone kind of forgets about it as another niche scientific thing. So what do you have to say about making sure this is sustained, it has a sustained level of interest and prioritization?
I really thank you for that. That's hugely important. I have a lot of optimism that it's going to, because some of the countries that are home to the most abundant blue carbon systems, it's a priority for them because it's a priority for their constituents. And now that we've got it in the UNFCCC, the Paris Climate Accord, that this can be counted towards their contribution to avoiding the worst of climate change and hopefully staying below 1.5, is that this is the primary way they can contribute. And so therefore it is an absolute essential priority for them, which will sustain it. And these are important countries that have big voices on the stage. This is Australia, Indonesia, Colombia, Ecuador. So it's something that I think that they're going to be able to sustain because frankly, it's their priority for their own future. But it's a really good question. I mean, sometimes I think climate change in and of itself is starting to be not the headline, right? This week is Climate Week here in New York. That's why I'm here. It's why many are here. It's why I have blisters all over my feet because I've been running around Manhattan. When I look every day, every morning, I open up the New York Times on my phone, on my app. What are the headlines coming through? We've got the UN General Assembly. They're having meetings on sea level rise. They're having meetings on, climate migration, these adaptation needs. Nature's not on the agenda. You open it up, you don't see anything about nature, and you hardly see anything about climate change, right? When we had the US debate recently, there was one question about it, and it was at the very, 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 very end. So I think sustaining is one thing, but I think we actually need to continue to elevate not just blue carbon, but all of these issues and the incredibly important role that nature plays in mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Great, thank you, Ashley. That's wonderful and a great way, I think, to end the panel. And I just want to say what an honor it is to have you on the stage, as an expert in carbon credits and supporting the movie, and to have Brad with his experience as a forest ecologist and a restoration ecologist and mangrove expert, and so glad to have you on the team here at NYBG. And Sarah, thank you so much for making such a wonderful and amazing film. It's really a real honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.